Everyone knows about the 12 tribes of Israel, the sons of Jacob, the pillars of a chosen nation. Their names are etched into the foundations of Scripture, their legacy preached in pulpits and studied in seminaries. But what if I told you there were other tribes, 12 of them, also descended from Abraham, also promised by God, yet almost entirely forgotten? What if the first son of Abraham, Ishmael, was not cast off, but heard by God, blessed and destined to become the father of 12 rulers? That's not theory. That's Genesis 17:20. I will bless him, and he shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. It's a verse that sits quietly in most Bibles, rarely preached, barely explored, yet filled with profound implications. So why don't we talk about them? Why do we know every corner of Israel's tribal history, but barely whisper the names of Ishmael's sons? Is it because Ishmael wasn't the chosen heir? Or is there something deeper, something we've missed, something sacred hidden in the silence? If you've ever felt like your story didn't matter, like you were born into a shadow instead of a spotlight, then Ishmael's story might speak to you in ways the world never could. His life began in tension, born not to a wife, but to a servant, not in celebration, but in compromise. And yet, God heard him. God named him. God promised him a future. That alone is a mystery worth uncovering. So stay with me, because in this journey, we're going to rediscover 12 tribes lost in the pages of history. Tribes that once thrived in the deserts of Arabia, whispered through trade routes and kingships, and maybe, just maybe, still echo through the lands and people we see today. If that stirs your curiosity, even just a little, like this video, and share it with someone who loves to go deeper. And if you're ready to walk into a forgotten legacy buried just beneath the sands of Scripture, let's begin. The son who came first, the origin of Ishmael. Long before the cries of Isaac echoed in Abraham's tent, another cry had pierced the silence, a child born not from Sarah, but from her servant Hagar. Ishmael came first. His story is older than Jacob's, older than the tribes of Israel, older even than Mount Sinai's thunder. And yet he often stands in the shadows, remembered more for his absence from the covenant than the reality of his presence in God's promise. Abraham's longing for a child had stretched for years. He and Sarah had waited on God, but time dragged on and hope, once blazing, began to flicker. In a moment of human frailty, Sarah offered Hagar to her husband, hoping to fulfill the promise through her own design. Hagar conceived, and Ishmael was born into a family already unraveling under the weight of expectations. His name, given by an angel before he ever drew breath, means God will hear. Not God might not if he chooses to. It was a statement of divine certainty in the midst of human brokenness. Genesis 16:11 captures it clearly. You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. Imagine being that child born into tension, caught between a divine promise and a human plan. Ishmael wasn't the mistake. He wasn't the problem. He was the evidence that God hears even in the margins. His story reminds us that being first doesn't always mean being chosen in the way the world defines it, but it doesn't mean being forgotten either. And yet, as Isaac's birth brought laughter to the camp, it also deepened the divide. Eventually, Hagar and Ishmael were sent away into the wilderness, a painful scene, but one that reveals a deeper truth. Even in the wilderness, God met them. Even in exile, the Lord provided. Some of you may know what it feels like to be pushed aside to walk a road you didn't choose. But Ishmael's journey assures us being sent away is not the same as being abandoned. So what became of the child in the desert? Scripture says he grew strong, became a skilled archer, and lived in the wilderness of Paran. But that wasn't the end of the story, because God had made a promise to Abraham, yes, but also to the boy. Ishmael wouldn't just survive, he would become the father of nations. But how many nations? And who were they? That's where the story gets even more mysterious. The divine promise, 12 rulers from Ishmael. When God speaks, his words are never careless. In Genesis 17:20, he says of Ishmael, I will bless him. He shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. This wasn't a throwaway line. It was a parallel to the future of Jacob, who would also father 12 tribes. But while Jacob's descendants would become the focus of much of Scripture, Ishmael's 12 sons would spread quietly, their stories tucked into history, prophecy, and perhaps most intriguingly, geography. Genesis 25:13-15 lists their names: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbel, Mibsam, Mishma, Dumah, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. Each one a founder, each one a prince, each one carrying the echo of God's promise through the wilderness. There is something profoundly symbolic in the number 12. It suggests order, completeness, structure, a sacred pattern God uses again and again. 12 sons of Israel, 12 apostles, 12 gates in the New Jerusalem. So what does it mean that Ishmael also had 12 sons? Could it be that his line, though not part of the covenant in the same way, still had a divine structure and purpose? Some suggest these tribes had a unique spiritual role to play outside the camp, but not outside God's reach. For centuries, these 12 princes would become tribal patriarchs across vast desert lands, forming networks of trade, kinship, and at times conflict. Their presence shaped the fabric of the ancient Middle East. But who were they really? What did they do? And where did they go? That trail leads us out of the promise and into the shifting sands where these tribes took root. Their names may not be preached from pulpits, but history remembers. And if we follow the map left behind in scripture and stone, we may just find that the sons of Ishmael didn't vanish, they scattered. And in that scattering, they built something lasting. Let's trace their footsteps. Beyond the desert, where did the tribes go? The wilderness didn't swallow the sons of Ishmael, it shaped them. From the moment they stepped into history, these 12 tribes began to move across deserts, along trade routes, through valleys and oases, carrying with them both the promise of God and the resilience of survival. According to the biblical record in Genesis 25:18, they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. That's not a poetic flourish. It's a vast geographical arc stretching from the southern reaches of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula through the Arabian deserts and into parts of Mesopotamia. The Arabian Peninsula became their heartbeat. This wasn't empty wasteland, it was a living, breathing network of nomadic life. Modern nations like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates occupy what was once a canvas for these tribes. Some lived in the rocky highlands, some roamed across the open sands, and others established hubs in ancient cities like Tema, Dumah, or Kedar's domain. They adapted quickly, becoming herders, merchants, traders, and warriors. And over time, their influence stretched beyond the peninsula. Traces of them appear in the Levant in Egypt and even in the fringes of North Africa. In places like Sudan and the Gulf of Aqaba, echoes of their migrations still linger in oral traditions and regional lore. But what's striking is not just their mobility, it's their durability. Despite the harshness of their environment, these tribes didn't just survive, they thrived. They built relationships with neighboring peoples. They appeared in Assyrian records. They controlled trade routes essential to the ancient world. If you've ever driven across the deserts of Jordan or watched the sun rise over the Red Sea, you've seen the landscapes they once called home. Now pause for a moment. Have you ever considered that the same land where these tribes roamed is still lived in today? That the soil beneath a marketplace in Mecca or a Bedouin camp in Oman might carry the footprints of Ishmael's children. History is closer than we think, and the names, those ancient names, weren't just for the scrolls. They meant something. They meant someone. And their stories are just beginning to unfold. Meet the 12. Stories behind the names. These weren't just names listed in passing. They were people, leaders, founders of clans that shaped a region. And though the biblical account gives us only a glimpse, history, archaeology, and tradition help fill in the silhouette of each one. Nebaioth, the firstborn, is often linked with the Nabateans, those mysterious traders who carved Petra into the rose-red rock of Edom. Some scholars suggest his descendants laid the foundations for that great culture, blending Aramaic roots with Arabian identity. Kedar, the second son, is more visible in Scripture. Mentioned in Isaiah 67, his tribe was known for their flocks and dark tents, and they became famous in the ancient world for their wealth in livestock and their strategic location along incense trade routes. Adbeel may have led a tribe near the Sinai Peninsula. While details are sparse, some linguistic scholars see a connection between his name and early Arabic forms, like Abdullah, suggesting a theological depth in tribal identity. Mibsam and Mishma are less visible in history, but Chronicles 1 links Mishma's descendants with Simeonites, a possible fusion between Israelite and Ishmaelite bloodlines that hints at cooperation or intermarriage in Egypt. Then there's Dumah, a name that appears not only in Joshua 15:52 as a city in Canaan, but also in Assyrian texts as a stronghold of Arab resistance. Ancient inscriptions describe Dumah as a fortified city, and its kings were even recognized by Assyrian rulers. Massa is another tribe etched into desert rock. Archaeologists have found graffiti near ancient Tema referencing Massa alongside other Ishmaelite tribes, suggesting alliances or shared territories. Hadad may have links to the Harite people near Palmyra in Syria, suggesting that his tribe moved northward into what would later become a Roman province. Tema, as an oasis city, held strategic power for trade, connecting caravan routes from southern Arabia to Damascus and beyond. Even today, the ruins of Tema in Saudi Arabia reveal inscriptions, temples, and palaces that whisper the remnants of its ancient prestige. Finally, Kedar, Naphish, and Kedar are mentioned together in 1 Chronicles 5:19 as tribes defeated by the half-tribe of Manasseh, showing they were once powerful enough to wage war with Israel's own. Some traditions even suggest that Caleb, the bold spy who stood with Joshua, may have descended from one of these lines, possibly Kedar, though this remains speculation. Each of these names is like a doorway. Some lead to ruins, others to inscriptions or dusty trade records, but all of them trace back to one man in a desert, blessed by God, heard in his pain, and promised a future. And these tribes, for all their diversity and distance, carried that future forward. But what happened when these tribes began to interact not just with each other, but with the wider family of Abraham? The answer reveals a complex mosaic of brotherhood, rivalry, and forgotten kinships that still echo in the fabric of the Middle East. Let's look closer. A family, Mosaic, Ishmaelites, Midianites, and the broader bloodline. The story of Ishmael's 12 tribes doesn't exist in isolation. They were part of something far more intricate, a divine family tapestry woven from the life of Abraham, a man who would become the father of many nations, not just one. After Sarah's death, Abraham took another wife named Keturah, and through her, he fathered 6 more sons, including Midian, Genesis 25, 1-2. The descendants of these sons, especially the Midianites, would go on to shape the biblical landscape alongside Ishmael's line. Scripture reveals that the Ishmaelites and Midianites were not distant cousins locked in competition, but often companions. In Genesis 37:28, it is a caravan of Ishmaelites and Midianites that purchases Joseph from his brothers and carries him into Egypt. This passage alone hints at a close-knit relationship between the two groups, one that involved shared journeys, trade ventures, and possibly intermarriage. Some biblical genealogies even group the Ishmaelites and Midianites interchangeably, further blurring the line between the two. Historically, both groups occupied regions in and around the Arabian Peninsula. Midian's territory was located in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia, adjacent to the lands of many Ishmaelite tribes. These shared borders fostered cultural overlap, especially in the areas of commerce and nomadic traditions. Both groups became masters of the desert, thriving where others could not, navigating harsh landscapes with camels, caravans, and a deeply rooted knowledge of survival. Over time, their families would blend, and their identities would intertwine. But here's where modern understanding often falls short. In contemporary discourse, it's common to lump all Arabs into the lineage of Ishmael. This oversimplification overlooks the diverse Semitic bloodlines that also trace back to Abraham through Keturah, through Esau, through Lot's daughters, and beyond. Not all Arabs are Ishmaelites, just as not all Semites are Israelites. The biblical Middle East was a complex web of relations, brothers, cousins, rivals, and allies. To paint it with one brushstroke is to erase the richness of that divine mosaic. So when we speak of the Ishmaelites, we are speaking of a core thread in that larger tapestry, a thread that intersects with Midianite wisdom, Edomite legacies, and even the prophetic voices of the Old Testament. And that realization should lead us to ask a deeper question: if this bloodline shaped more than just ancient trade routes, if it helped shape prophetic history, then where is it now? And what echoes of it still remain in our world today? Modern reflection: where are they now? The story of Ishmael's tribes didn't end in the ancient world. Though their names may have faded from the lips of modern generations, their descendants did not vanish. They adapted, they blended, they endured. Today, the spiritual and cultural footprints of these tribes remain scattered across the Middle East, etched not in stone tablets, but in place, names, family traditions, and regional identities. Many scholars and historians agree that the Arabian Peninsula, particularly Saudi Arabia, is home to a significant number of people descended from Ishmael's line. The Gulf of Aqaba, the deserts of Sinai, the valleys of Jordan, the oasis cities of northern Arabia, all of these regions were once touched by the 12 tribes. And while some names like Kedar and Tema have direct archaeological and linguistic links to modern places, others survive more subtly, through oral traditions, linguistic patterns, or cultural memory. What's more, many Ishmaelites became indistinguishable from their Midianite cousins, and eventually from broader Arab populations. Their nomadic nature and integration into the rise of Islam meant their tribal names were often absorbed or reinterpreted. Yet even in that blending, the legacy of Ishmael remains. In Islamic tradition, Ishmael is revered as a prophet, and his connection to Mecca and the Kaaba is considered foundational. That spiritual memory still burns bright in the hearts of millions. But beyond theology, there's something personal about this legacy. It reminds us that God doesn't discard people just because they don't fit the expected path. The world may lose their names. The pages of history may turn without fanfare. But heaven remembers. And in remembering it, honors the promise made to a boy in the desert, a boy whose name meant God hears. So as we consider where these tribes went, maybe we're also being invited to ask where we are now. Are we walking in stories we don't even know? Are we part of a bigger plan that stretches farther than we can trace? And if God could remember a child cast into the wilderness, could he not remember you? The story of Ishmael and his 12 sons is not just a historical footnote, it's a mirror held up to the human heart. A reminder that God's promises are not limited by human expectations. That being overlooked by people does not mean being forgotten by heaven. Ishmael wasn't the chosen heir in the way we usually define it, but he was never out of God's sight. He was heard, he was named, and he was blessed. And the tribes that came from him, though, scattered and absorbed across time, carried that blessing forward into the world. Maybe that's the message still echoing today. In a world obsessed with who gets the spotlight, the story of Ishmael invites us to consider the quiet legacies, the lives lived outside the center, the voices that still matter, even when they're not the loudest. And maybe you felt that way too. Not quite the one people expected, not quite part of the inner circle. But what if your story, like Ishmael's, is part of a much bigger plan, one that hasn't been forgotten, even if it's been overlooked? Thank you for walking this path with me today. If something in this story stirred your curiosity or awakened something deeper, I invite you to like this video so that others can discover these forgotten truths. Share it with someone who's hungry to understand the fullness of Scripture. And in the comments, tell me, was there a tribe that surprised you? A detail you'd never heard before? I read everyone. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so you won't miss the next journey into the mysteries of the Bible. Whether we explore the 12 tribes of Israel, the line of Esau, or the ancient watchers of Genesis, this is a place where forgotten stories find a voice again. May the God who heard Ishmael hear you. May he meet you in the wilderness, call you by name, and remind you that your path, no matter how hidden, is never without purpose. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep seeking the truth that still speaks.